Castles. Citadels of world heritage. All over Europe, millions flock to see these masterpieces in stone. They are drawn by the astonishing scale of construction and by a sense of a lost world of heroism and chivalry. But castles are more than magnificent monuments to a past that's dead and gone. They hold the key to understanding a crucial period in the growth of our civilization. In this series, we're on a journey to discover how castles were built and why they were constructed the way they were. How that changed over the centuries, and why they still have a grip on our imagination today. We'll meet the castle builders, the labourers and masons who did the hard work, the geniuses of design who imagined these medieval megastructures, the structural engineers who turned them into reality, and the kings and barons who commissioned them and lived in them. We'll show how the big history of the Middle Ages, the wars of France and England, shaped the castle. And how, in 1,000 bloody sieges and battles, the castle changed the course of that history. If you want to understand how the modern world was constructed, you need to understand the castle builders. How do you build on a massive scale? And how was it done centuries ago without the aid of modern machines and computing power? Any major construction project is something little short of a miracle, a breathtaking combination of ingenuity, craft, organization, and hard labor. It takes determination, skill, planning, and lots of money. The same was true 1,000 years ago. The technology may have moved on, but for the castle builders, the basic challenges were the same.
These people are engineers and they've got to have the knowledge to make these things stay up. What are the physics behind these buildings? Now, I dare say they're not writing equations down, but they must know exactly what works.
In this episode, we'll see how some of the great castles of Europe were built, how the ideas and techniques behind their construction changed and developed in a few short centuries. How kings and barons found the resources and manpower to start building castles, and why they spent fortunes on finishing them.
By building this great castle with multicoloured towers, it has mythic and legendary importance.
And how all of this happened on a huge scale, at a frenetic pace, and often in the heart of hostile territory.
So you might have to think of what it must be like to try and establish somewhere like Camp Bastion in Afghanistan.
The result? Some of the world's most beautiful and iconic structures, objects of admiration and wonder centuries later, buildings that have stood the test of time.
It's this odd combination, isn't it? On the one hand, fine living and domesticity and where did the king eat his dinner? And on the other hand, ultra-violence.
For millennia, humans have built in stone. And even before the Romans came, saw, and conquered northern Europe, the stone ramparts of the hill fort gave shelter and comfort to 1,000 local tribes. The hill forts were power bases for their territorial ambitions and places of safety to raise their families. In a world of brutal raids and invasions, an impregnable defensive fortress has obvious advantages. That's why the Romans raised stone forts to protect their legions as they pushed the boundaries of their empire wider and wider. And why they built walls to define and defend the extremities of the world they conquered. But it wasn't until the 11th century that the European castle, as we now think of it, began to take shape.
A castle's primarily to defend a lord or a noble or a king, his family and his household, and also to command the territory of which he's the owner. And in that way it differs from a fort or fortress, which is there to protect a company of soldiers.
The earliest castles were built from earth and timber. A huge mound of soil, a motte, was built up with a wooden tower on top. The motte was surrounded by a bailey, a larger defensive enclosure protected by a ditch and an earthen rampart.
The thing that is most difficult for people in the 21st century to grasp is that early castles, 99% of them, are made of wood. The thousands of castles that are put up over Western Europe in the Middle Ages are earth and timber.
This is the site of one of the first timber castles built in Britain. "40 metres across and 8 metres high, it's known as Hen Domen, meaning in Welsh simply Old Mound. But that scarcely does justice to the qualities of the motte and bailey castles.
They were much more sophisticated than they appear on the ground today. They would be elaborated with timber defences and contain significant timber buildings. They would look very sophisticated were we able to see them in their heyday.
Hen Domen stands guard over a strategically important ford across the River Severn. It was built in 1070 by Roger, Earl of Shrewsbury. He named it Montgomery Castle, after his home in Normandy. It was the Norman conquest which made the castle a significant feature of the English countryside.
England before 1066 was a land without castles. They have horses, but they don't ride them into battle, and nor do they have castles. And it's those two things in combination, cavalry forces, but most especially castles, that give the Normans the cutting edge, the advantage.
The castle was the Norman way of taking control. All over England, William the Conqueror's knights began to throw up hundreds of motte and bailey castles.
What was good about them is they're very quick to construct. You can construct a stronghold in alien or enemy territory quickly and provide a point of defence and a point of security for the people and the animals that you brought with you.
The motte and bailey had given the Normans a stranglehold on England. The next crucial innovation was the stone keep, a defensive stronghold at the heart of the castle. But masonry threw up its own challenges for the castle builders.
You need to be able to obtain the raw materials, quarry the stone, fell the timber, create the lime mortar. And then you needed craftsmen trained in putting all that together. When the Normans came to England, there wasn't a long tradition of masonry building, but there were churches, but most of the houses were built of timber and earth. So these skills had to be either brought over or developed.
The Normans were very happy to import the sophisticated skills in masonry they needed to construct robust defensive structures on a grand scale. This is Rochester Castle in Kent, one of the earliest and best examples of the stone keep. The keep is the imposing central feature of the castle. It shelters a basement and 3 floors, as well as galleries and battlements. The grandest of the rooms were on the 2nd floor, with a mezzanine to give them extra height. The spine wall is pierced to form an arcade of 4 round-headed arches. The accommodation could be reached by spiral staircases in 2 opposite corners of the keep, and there were vaulted ceilings and fireplaces, and passageways to access the battlements. The exterior walls get their rough appearance from the irregular rubble used to build them. Kentish ragstone, a hard grey limestone quarried locally. But the angles of the buttresses, doors and windows are yellow in colour. They're from Caen stone, imported across the Channel from Normandy. Rochester Castle was actually built by an Archbishop of Canterbury, William of Corbeil. A prince-bishop, a baron in his own right, it was William who completed the construction of Canterbury Cathedral. But he was also a castle builder. And if there was any doubt that the princes of the church were also keenly interested in temporal power, then Rochester Castle is the plainest possible statement of intent. Rochester's primary function is purely practical. It's a secure fortress. But even this early example declares that the castle has a symbolic purpose too. At almost 35 metres high, the lime-washed keep would have declared its power and authority over all the surrounding countryside. The interior of a castle, too, could be used to proclaim the might and glory of its builder. Not far from Rochester in Kent is the great tower of Dover Castle. It was the last of the great square keeps built in England after the Norman conquest. A royal palace of King Henry II, it's recently been restored to look as it might have done in the 1180s. The King's chamber was his private apartment. It was shared with servants and senior officials, and it was where the business of government was carried out. The King's Hall was a place of meeting and assembly, used for ceremonies and feasts. It proclaimed that if the king was on his throne, all was right with the world. An army of servants in the kitchen below would have kept the king and his guests well fed. The entertainment was certainly lavish. But the spaciousness and grandeur of the living quarters shouldn't blind us to the fact that Dover was a castle that needed defending strongly. Known as the key to England, it was attacked by French armies and rebellious barons. A military stronghold and an official residence, Dover accommodates both functions of a castle with a grace that belies how difficult it is to integrate the two.
It's this odd combination, isn't it? On the one hand, fine living and domesticity and where did the king eat his dinner? And on the other hand, ultra-violence. You know, you've got boiling oil and catapults and sieges. If you combine a fortress and a stately home, it's a very difficult proposition because, you know, if you want a fortress, you've got to have thick walls and small windows and keep people out. And if you want a stately home, you've got to have lots of light and luxury and big windows. And so it's a very difficult balancing act, creating a building that is at the same time homely and warlike.
Few castles blend beauty and strength as perfectly as this one. Chateau Gaillard was built here in the valley of the Seine in Normandy by one of the great kings of European history. Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, was the hero king of the Crusades and of the tales of Robin Hood. The son of Henry II, who built Dover, Richard inherited the title of Duke of Normandy from his father. He was determined to assert his authority against the King of France, to secure his territories and his lines of communication.
Il construit ce château pour défendre la Normandie des incursions françaises, puisque le roi français essaye de prendre le duché de Normandie pour lui. Et à cet endroit-là particulièrement, puisque le territoire d'Andely permet de bloquer 2 voies d'entrée dans la Normandie, la voie terrestre et la voie fluviale, surtout par rapport à la Seine.
Begun in 1196, the chateau was to be a structure entirely new to 12th century France. Surrounded by a ditch 12 meters deep, it was a tier-shaped fortification. Its ingenious design of sheer, round towers made it almost impossible to attack with projectiles. Urged on by Richard himself, an army of labourers worked tirelessly, putting in 2.5 million shifts of work, racing against time, weather, and the imminent attack of the French.
Alors il est construit très rapidement grâce à beaucoup de choses. Déjà, eh bien, on va prendre de la pierre locale, des matériaux locaux. Alors, toute la pierre est issue finalement du creusement des fossés, puisque les fossés qui entourent le château sont creusés à la main par les ouvriers. Et les pierres qu'on extrait vont servir à construire les murs du château. Et puis effectivement, il y a beaucoup de personnes qui vont venir travailler à la construction de ce château. Pendant 2 ans que va durer la construction totale du site d'Andely, eh bien, il va y avoir 6000 ouvriers au total et environ 2500 ouvriers tous les jours à la construction du château Gaillard.
To ensure a supply of water for the castle, 2 wells were dug down to the river level, 100 meters below. The wells were so deep and dark that the diggers had to excavate the stone by torchlight, panting under the strain of oxygen deprivation, as the breathable air was burned away by the flames that lit their work. Richard's budget stretched to 12.7 million ducats, many hundreds of millions today, and a huge percentage of a medieval economy. Richard himself took personal charge of construction, and historians think of him as the architect of its unique design. Before 2 years had passed, Chateau Gaillard was complete. The king could glory in a prodigious achievement. And this is what Richard saw, his revolutionary miracle castle. So beautiful he called it his 1-year-old daughter. So strong, it gave him command and control over the key river route below. Visionary determination was one thing, but castles could not be built without the craft skills of masters and masons. And to appreciate their work properly, it's time to move to another theatre of conflict. The kings of England also faced a challenge on their western flank from the rebellious Welsh. The castle was central to the power struggle which ensued. Within a quarter of a century of the conquest, the Normans had built the great tower of Chepstow Castle on the River Wye. They now controlled the gateway to South Wales. Soon, the Normans had forced their way along the southern Welsh coast, and everywhere they went, they built castles. From Cardiff to Kidwelly, and as far west as Pembroke. The castles gave the Normans control of the coastal strip, the so-called Welsh Marches. Wales was to become a country with more castles per square mile than any other. But the border between these marches and the native-held uplands of Wales proper was contested territory. Wales was a very different prospect from the Anglo-Saxon lands that the Normans had conquered so rapidly. It would take the Normans 200 years to subdue the Welsh. The mountainous terrain was ideal for guerrilla-style resistance. And unlike England, Wales was divided into many competing kingdoms. Defeating one Welsh leader was no guarantee that any of the others would fall into line. Young warlords like the Lord Rhys play the Normans at their own game. By using cavalry and building stone castles of their own, right across southwest Wales. The Lord Rhys claws back power from the Norman marcher lords. His 12th century Deheubarth glitters with a network of lime-washed castles. Power bases for the native Welsh. The Lord Rhys has shown that it is possible to arrest the forward march of the Normans. And their own trump card, the castle, is key to stopping them. A century later, Llywelyn ap Griffith, Llywelyn the Last, compels the Normans to recognise that he is Prince of Wales. Llywelyn has castles of his own. Castles like Dol Badarn, where the native Welsh round tower is used as a centrepiece of defensive architecture. Llywelyn is strong in his mountain fastnesses. So strong that he can strike a deal with the English king. On the 29th of September 1267, Llywelyn meets Henry III at a ford on the border between England and Wales. It's a formal meeting place to ratify a formal agreement, the Treaty of Montgomery. It grants Llywelyn power and authority over Wales. Providing he pays homage to the English king, Llywelyn is free to extend his rule. Castles like Castell y Bere, built by his grandfather Llywelyn the Great, give him control over areas of Wales far beyond Snowdonia itself. From his strongholds in Gwynedd, Llywelyn raids Norman territory in the south. The young Norman lord, Gilbert de Clare, Gilbert the Red, is willing to break new ground to meet this threat. He diverts a river to create artificial lakes. It's all part of an enterprising plan to build one of the largest castles in the whole of Europe. It's the first castle in Britain designed to be defended by walls within walls. Its scale is imposing even today.
He didn't choose to build Caerphilly on top of a hill or on a mountain. He didn't choose a naturally defendable position. He wanted to lay out a new form of elaborate castle in which there were multiple layers of defence. Every time he passed an obstacle, he faced another obstacle. So you go through one gatehouse and be faced with another gatehouse. You cross one drawbridge and be faced with a portcullis and a pair of doors. And each time you approached one of these structures, you were under fire from the adjacent towers and curtain walls. And then he wanted to surround that with areas of water that could keep potential attackers and their siege engines away.
The key person in Gilbert's project is his master mason. Like a modern architect, he designs the building. But he's a craftsman himself and understands how other craftsmen work. A skilled military engineer, he contracts all the other workers. Next to the master mason, the principal workers are the freemasons, expert stone cutters and sculptors. They're working at the sharp end of the logistical challenge.
Every single stone there has been hacked out by hand from a quarry, pre-mechanised age, so all done manually with hand tools, and then transported in some cases over ridiculous distances. You don't have proper roads, you don't have proper vehicles to go on those proper roads, and you're reliant on river transport and tracks to get this stuff to one place in enormous quantities, absolutely enormous quantities. Then you start building.
The castle builders are engaged in a massive project, which makes the minutiae of their work even more impressive to the trained eye.
And it's just that meticulous detail and the thousands and thousands, again, probably hundreds of thousands of hours that have been expended just creating those fine details. Door edges, the window frames, the archways.
The devil is in the detail. But as the walls rise higher, someone needs to keep an eye on the big picture and to solve the major architectural problems which the site throws up.
We have these huge spur buttresses which merge with the walls to either side, them all built out of single pieces of graduating size. The sheer ingenuity, we need to carry this wall into a parapet that juts over it by a few inches, and we'll have one piece of stone that actually carries that job, and we'll have several of them in graduating size moving down the line of this wall, and somebody is cutting these to order, to a plan, and they're putting them all together by hand. You've got to have the masons with the capability of doing that work, and also somebody actually capable of designing this thing and giving them effectively what you call a spec in modern days.
Work begins at Caerphilly Castle on the 11th of April 1268, and the master mason's genius means the major work on the core of the castle is completed within 3 short years. Gilbert's workers have earned their payday. Their astonishing achievement will stand for centuries. It's a tribute to their physical and intellectual prowess.
They've got to have the knowledge to make these things stay up. What are the physics behind these buildings? Now, I dare say they're not writing equations down, but they must have plans. They must know exactly what works, so they've been brought in, whoever Gilbert's architect and engineers were, brought in for that purpose because they've achieved the same elsewhere.
Caerphilly reasserts Norman control over lowland Wales. But it's not the end of this power struggle. Faced with an unassailable bastion like Caerphilly, Llywelyn ap Griffith is pushed back north to his strongholds in Snowdonia. There's a new English king, Edward I, Edward Longshanks. Edward begins to build castles of his own around the coasts of northern Wales. He's a vigorous king and in a hurry to impose his rule over all of Britain. When Llywelyn refuses to pay homage, Edward sends in the troops. And there's worse to come. In 1282, Llywelyn's wife Eleanor dies in childbirth, leaving him with no male heir. With little left to lose, Llywelyn decides to join his brother in a desperate uprising against the English. A month later, Wales will have lost its leader. Run through in a chance encounter with an English knight, the Prince of Wales is dead. Edward decides to press home his advantage. The upshot? The completion of Edward's so-called Ring of Iron around North Wales. It's the most ambitious programme of castle building anywhere in medieval Europe. And all the more remarkable because the workforce recruited from all over England is being sent into remote and still extremely hostile territory.
So you might have to think of what it must be like to try and establish somewhere like Camp Bastion in Afghanistan. You're sending people out to work in very difficult circumstances in an area where there weren't necessarily materials available or tools. All of that would have to be brought in.
To drive the enterprise forward, Edward established an office of the King's Works in Conwy on the northern coast of Wales. His key recruit was a master mason he'd come across in Savoy as he was returning overland from the Crusades to claim his throne. James of St. George became master of the King's Works in Wales. His distinctive signature is to be found in detail after architectural detail in all of Edward's great Welsh castles. Some key talents coalesced around Master James. There was his ingeniator, his military engineer, Bertrand de Soltu, his principal carpenter, Philip Center, and Stephen the painter, his chief decorative artist. The locations identified for the castles had one thing in common: they could be supplied directly from the sea. If the rebellious Welsh blockaded them by land, Edward could ship in men and supplies to lift the siege. There was Conwy itself, and further west, Caernarfon. And finally, designed as a perfect set of concentric defences, Beaumaris on Anglesey was the last to be built. Work had begun at Harlech in April 1283. Its massive Barbican towers and fortified path, the way to the sea below, made Harlech a definitive statement of medieval engineering. Today, Harlech is landlocked, looking out over land reclaimed from the sea. Back then, it stood directly above the shoreline.
They've picked the site, haven't they? You can see it, and as with all of Edward's castles, really, they're very visible in one way or another. They must have been absolutely shocking things to behold for the local population. If you see the sea and the various major river channels as the highways of the age, these things were very, very visible. You would pass them as you headed along the coast or as you headed up waterways inland. So you always have to remember that you've got water at the base of the rock that it's on. They really send a message across that this is it, we're here and we're not moving anywhere.
The raw materials to build Harlech came from far and wide. Stone from Caernarfon, lime from Anglesey, timber from Flint, lead from Bristol, and iron from the English Midlands. And the scale of the work was a wonder to behold.
There were 950 men at the height of the building season involved in that one castle. gives you some idea of the sort of logistics necessary to bring those people there, to feed them, to house them, to provide them with tools, materials and equipment to enable them to build these buildings at considerable speed and under the eyes of a recently conquered people.
The castle building can't start or finish without the work of the carpenters.
The timbers, you probably deforested an entire region and further afield just providing yourself with timber for, flooring, scaffolding. I mean, the scaffolding must have been a thing in itself. You're talking hundreds and hundreds, thousands of metres of timber stacked up the sides of buildings, going around corners, just to put this great structure in place. Roofing, flooring, bridges, windows. Temporary structures alone must have, could probably build a small village or a small town with them.
Fitting out a multi-storey tower was a major project in itself. The final adornment was the decorative work. Artists used stencils and pouncing, a technique of pricking a pattern in paper, and then forcing powder through the holes to leave an outline on the working surface below. The painted halls and chambers of the castle may have been seen only by a privileged few, but they proclaimed a king's wealth and preeminence to his barons and courtiers.
These were great men who liked living in lavish surroundings, so you'd have plasterers and painters and people who could make and lay tiles and all the other very colourful things that made castles such a remarkable feature to those who came and visited.
The work was exquisite, but the cost was astronomical. It dwarfed the spending on castles like Dover and Chateau Gaillard. It was enough to bankrupt a king, and very nearly did. Edward emptied his coffers and was forced to borrow heavily from foreign bankers and repeatedly to beg Parliament for funds. As rivers of pennies flowed into Wales to pay the workforce on these vast projects, the king demanded meticulous records of every item of expenditure.
The thing that always strikes me is just the sheer opulence, the sheer cost, almost obscene wealth that's gone into building these things. The spend is out of all proportion, really, to almost anything else that's being built at the time.
Struggling to keep within his budget, Master James faced dilemmas familiar to anyone who's ever engaged a builder.
So if you pay somebody by the day, they're never in a rush to finish. What's the incentive for them to finish? If you pay them by the piece or by the task, you've got to have people working for you who can certify what they've done. So you're having to pay somebody else to measure what they've done. And if you pay someone a fixed sum contract, you spend all your time arguing over changes, additions, and details. So you spend all your time arguing over the price. And so whichever way you choose, and whenever you've done this in the past or today, those are the choices that you face. And no method is necessarily better than the other, but you have to apply them in different circumstances.
No matter how careful he was in choosing the most economical method of paying his workforce, Master James was under huge pressure to justify every line of expenditure. In case you should wonder where so much money could go in a week, he wrote to the king in 1296, we would have you know that we have needed 400 masons, 2,000 less skilled workmen, 100 carts, 60 wagons and 30 boats, 200 quarrymen, 30 smiths and carpenters. Edward could be the sternest of taskmasters. But the end result of all this labour pleased him. In 1290, the king appointed Master James as constable of Harlech Castle. What better reward for the architect than to live in the gatehouse he himself had created? The jewel amongst Edward's North Wales castles, and by today the most famous, is Caernarvon.
One glance at Caernarvon and you see that it's different. It was clearly designed to be different from the start. It doesn't have round towers, it has these sort of strange polygonal towers. The stonework is beautifully cut. It has these striped bands of stone, so it looks different from the start. And it was apparent that it was designed to be not just a castle, but a palace. A symbolic presence, if you like, of royal authority in Gwynedd.
In building Caernarvon Castle, Edward made a very deliberate attempt to conjure up the town's classical legacy as the home to a Roman legion 1,000 years before.
He builds it in a location where it has mythic and legendary importance. Caernarvon has legendary stories linked with the Emperor Constantine's father. His body was apparently found at Caernarvon and reinterred there under Edward I's orders. So by building this castle, which taps into the mythological stories about this great castle with multicoloured towers located on the mouth of a river, that positioning of Caernarvon aligns Edward with that whole mythological past, as well as his political reality in the present.
If proof was ever needed of how significant Caernarvon was for Edward I of England, we need look no further than the birth of his son and heir there in 1284.
The story of his birth is one of these incidents from history where fact meets legend and myth. This idea of Edward sending his, what would have been heavily pregnant wife, Eleanor, across what would have been very difficult country in order for this birth to take place symbolically in Caernarvon. This poor woman, heavily pregnant, being sent overland, to get to this castle, and when she arrives there, she finds, of course, a building site. They only started building the castle a year previously, so clearly it's nothing like the castle we see today.
In legend, at least, his son's birth in this castle gave Edward the opportunity for a flamboyant piece of political theatre. The story goes that the king had heard that the Welsh aristocracy who'd survived his wars was still hankering after a new Prince of Wales to lead them.
The Welsh lords said that they would only accept a countryman, someone from their own land. So Edward said, I offer you my new son. He is born here in Wales and he speaks not a word of English.
The tradition of the English monarch's eldest son being known as Prince of Wales continues to this day. Here at Caernarvon in 1969, Prince Charles became the latest to be invested with the title.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb.
One of our most popular pieces of film, which we have on the site, is actually the film of the 1969 investiture of Prince Charles, and particularly popular with audiences from America, I must say. They do like to see that and to walk where the Queen walked. And the thing I find interesting when I see it, knowing the site as I do, is the amount of work they must have done to put in all of the seating and other arrangements to sort of get everybody into the castle for that spectacular event seen around the world.
Almost 750 years after it was built, Edward's castle has lost none of its power to impress visitors from afar. And it still divides opinion amongst the local Welsh population, which it was designed to dominate.
Well, of course, as an architect, I have to say that it's, you know, that yes, I mean, it's a World Heritage Site and it's a magnificent building, but some people won't actually put a foot over the threshold here because it is still a sign of oppression.
Like it or not, Wales is recognised the world over as a land of castles. And there's no denying Caernarfon's place in that long history.
The heartening thing for me now is that if you look at Caernarfon, Caernarfon now has become a community which is Welsh-speaking, which is vibrant. And it could almost be argued that we've almost taken over that symbol of oppression.
Caernarfon, fit for a king. But like every castle, the people are part of its story too. The glories of medieval castles, their beauty and their opulence, burnished the status and mystique of royalty. The strength of these castles shielded the power of barons and overlords. They set in stone a feudal system which seems at odds with our more democratic age. But understood in a different light, these citadels have left a remarkable record of the work of the common people, the castle builders.
I think it's the thing that really helps you to empathise with the people who built the things in the first place. The labour force, I suppose. Human hands have shaped these structures, you know, huge towering things. Even if they survive just as a stubby ruin, there'll often sometimes be a detail, whether it's a mason making a mark on a piece of stone, a mason's mark. It's that sheer effort that always impresses.
Castles. Citadels of world heritage. All over Europe, millions flock to see these masterpieces in stone. They are drawn by the astonishing scale of construction and by a sense of a lost world of heroism and chivalry. But castles are more than magnificent monuments to a past that's dead and gone. They hold the key to understanding a crucial period in the growth of our civilization. In this series, we're on a journey to discover how castles were built and why they were constructed the way they were, how that changed over centuries, and why they still have a grip on our imagination today. We'll meet the castle builders, the labourers and masons who did the hard work, the geniuses of design who imagined these medieval megastructures, the structural engineers who turned them into reality, and the kings and barons who commissioned them and lived in them. We'll show how the big history of the Middle Ages, the wars of France and England, shaped the castle. And how, in 1,000 bloody sieges and battles, the castle changed the course of that history. If you want to understand how the modern world was constructed, you need to understand the castle builders. How do you capture a castle? And how do you best defend one? It's a matter of mind as well as of might. Centuries ago, warfare was conducted on a human scale. But even without today's weapons of mass destruction, a military onslaught could be a frightening experience. This is the story of how the castles stood up to attack, how those attacks became increasingly destructive, and how the castle builders worked tirelessly to strengthen and update their designs to counteract the force of arms. Sometimes they seem to come close to building the perfect, impregnable castle, only for yet more powerful weapons to be unleashed against it.
So you have your great stone-throwing machines, your catapults, your trebuchets, and you try and smash your way in and bring the castle crashing down.
In this war of escalating threats, the castle is surprisingly resilient.
Cromwell doesn't have the firepower that he needs to break through these huge medieval defences.
But will there come a time when surrender becomes inevitable?
Stone walls will splinter and crack because they can't absorb the energy of a fast-moving cannonball.
We often imagine the Middle Ages as an era dominated by violence. It's a rather unbalanced picture. For long periods right across Europe, people experienced peace and stability. Even those who had to work the land saw their health improve and their living standards rise. But in the end, they were ruled by coercion. Their overlords asserted their right through might. And the castle was the crucial instrument and symbol of aristocratic authority.
A castle's primarily to defend a lord or a noble or a king, his family and his household, and also to command the territory of which he's the owner.
From the 10th century onwards, thousands of castles sprang up all over Western Europe. But most of these castles have long since disappeared. That's because they shared one crucial disadvantage. They were made of wood. No wonder that those who could afford to built in stone.
By building defences in stone, you were able to keep your attacker away. He would be attacking you with siege engines, he'd be trying to undermine your defences, he'd be trying to set fire to your timber structures. Masonry gave you much greater security and provided a much more permanent answer to the problem of defence.
Masonry made the castle much more resilient. A properly constructed and defended stone keep was more than a match for the armoury of individual weapons which an attacking force might deploy against it. Most of these weapons are familiar to us. In their imaginations and in their play, children still love to get to grips with them. But back in medieval times, weapons were a deadly serious matter. Sword technology leapt forward in the Middle Ages, with the use of properly quenched, hardened, and tempered steel. In the hands of specialized bladesmiths, the sword became a fearsome weapon. Swords were forged in a great variety of forms. There were broadswords and claymores, two-handed swords and sabres, tucks and falchions and scimitars. Then there were clubs and maces, pikes and lances, crossbows and longbows. Against an individual opponent, these weapons could be deadly. And on the open battlefield, an armed knight could wreak havoc. But against a castle wall, none of this was of much avail. So military strategists began to turn to heavier armaments to try to force their way in.
If you wanted to break down castle walls, you needed the heavy artillery of the Middle Ages, which was the trebuchet, which could throw missiles up to 100 pounds in weight, and you would try to form a breach in the wall by constant bombardment by these devices with swinging arms that would sling these very heavy stones. There was a great skill in their construction and a great skill in their operation.
So you have your great stone-throwing machines, your catapults, your trebuchets, and you try and smash your way in and bring the castle crashing down. That can work, though one struggles to think of examples where it actually brings a castle down. You know, you can weaken the walls, you could certainly terrify the garrison, but you need several consecutive good hits in the same place to weaken the walls.
The trebuchet packed a decent punch, but it was no guarantee that the walls would come tumbling down. So when the strength of the castle's defences nullified the ferocity of the opening onslaught, the offensive forces had to settle down for the long game. If the storm came to nothing, the siege might win the prize.
If all else fails, you have to just sit and wait. The word siege itself means seat. You're sitting down with your army, waiting for the other side to run out of resources. But of course, if they're well provisioned, if they've got 6 to 12 months of resources, you might wait a very long time, through the winter perhaps, under canvas, and your troops might start to mutiny. You've got to keep your men healthy as well, and they're the ones without shelter. So it's a war of attrition.
A castle siege could be long and brutal. These walls were built long before humanitarian treaties and international law offered some protection to the combatants. Starvation was a tool of siege warfare, and warlords might have scant regard for the welfare of the pawns in their game. But this wasn't an age of total war. Negotiations and rules of engagement were observed as a matter of honour.
You could agree an honourable surrender in which the defenders were allowed to leave the castle or the town, and they would leave unmolested, but the attacker would take possession. And that was part of a sort of unwritten rules of war, that you often would agree a timetable in which this took place. So if you were a defender, you would try to agree a timetable that allowed a relieving force to come and drive away the besiegers.
If the defenders failed to honour a negotiated date of surrender, they gave up their right to safe passage, and they could only pray that the castle didn't fall into enemy hands.
If you broke these unwritten rules of siege, the rules of engagement were abandoned. The attackers could loot and pillage what they found, and the town or castle would be devastated.
One of the most famous sieges of the Middle Ages happened at Rochester in Kent. In the period after the signing of Magna Carta in 1215, King John had broken many of the promises he'd made. It provoked a widespread rebellion in England, and a battle for control of the country between king and barons. As today, Rochester Castle stood guard over one of the few bridges across a crucial waterway, the River Medway. When rebel barons seized the castle, King John knew he had to act. The king's men soon managed to regain control of the bridge, and they laid siege to the castle. The siege of 1215 was one of the bloodiest in English history. John was in no mood to be merciful. The king's archers sent volley after volley over the walls of the castle. But safe inside their stone ramparts, the defenders were hardly troubled. That may have been enough to enrage King John. He brought up no less than 5 siege engines to pound the defences. Rochester was going to be tested by trebuchet. The outer walls were shaken, but it still wasn't enough. Eventually, the king's men hit upon a different tactic. They managed to get into the bailey, the castle grounds, by undermining the castle wall. The rebels retreated to the heart of the castle, the keep, and that had been designed to withstand any onslaught. Rochester Castle had been built a century before the siege for William of Corbeil, a Norman prince-bishop. As Archbishop of Canterbury, William had overseen the completion of the cathedral there. He knew how to build robust structures. William's keep at Rochester was an imposing structure. 35 metres high, it was one of the tallest in England, dominating the surrounding countryside. But its design had one crucial weakness and one hidden strength. King John may not have known either of those things, but he had a secret plan of his own. "Send to us," he ordered his men, "with all speed by day and night, 40 of the fattest pigs." It was not such a crazy idea. In an age before gunpowder, pig fat could set a fire blazing with almost incendiary force. Inside the keep, the defenders must have been wondering what was happening. King John's men had dug a tunnel under the southeast corner of the keep. They'd shored up the foundations with wooden pit props. Then, with the fat from the pigs, they ignited a fire. The props, the tunnel, and the tower above came crashing down. The tower's weakness was now evident. Its square shape had left it susceptible to collapse if undermined. But now the inner strength of the keep showed itself. William of Corbeil had designed it with a sturdy cross wall that still splits it in half. The defenders were able to barricade themselves inside the surviving half of the keep. There they held out until eventually hunger forced them to surrender. The king's supporters, fearing reprisals against royal garrisons elsewhere, persuaded John to show mercy. There was only one execution. A bowman who'd switched sides, having been in the king's service since childhood. Later, the breach in the keep was rebuilt, this time as a stronger round tower, with an outer barbican to protect it. Centuries later, the trained eye can still spot the evidence of collapse in the reformed window arches of the retaining wall. And the chroniclers said of Rochester that our age has not known a siege so hard-pressed nor so strongly resisted. Afterwards, few cared to put their trust in castles. But the truth is that the castle was trusted to do its job. With continual improvements and refinements like round towers, moats and drawbridges, the original Motte and Bailey design had been transformed into an ever more formidable fortress. Two decades before the Rochester siege, King John's brother, Richard the Lionheart, had found a way to combine numerous round towers in one unbroken defensive line. This is his magnificent Chateau Gaillard in Normandy. Standing proudly against the forces of the kings of France, Gaillard's walls would not easily be brought down.
Donc Richard Cœur de Lion va faire construire une fortification en forme de triangle pour bloquer l'arrivée française ou ennemie. Et le château est construit de telle sorte qu'il y ait plusieurs retranchements, donc plusieurs murs d'enceinte. Ce château va se défendre de façon passive en espérant un petit peu fatiguer les ennemis avant qu'ils arrivent au cœur du château.
Building a castle on this scale required a monumental effort in time and money. But the end result was a statement of dominance. Chateau Gaillard stamped Richard's authority across a wide swathe of Normandy. Back across the Channel, his brother John was still battling to keep his grip on power. Dover Castle, known as the Key to England, shows him struggling to keep up in this period of transformation in defensive construction.
I think Dover Castle is a great example of the way that castle building technology changes around the turn of the 12th and 13th century, so around the year 1200. Because the castle that we see today, in the middle, the Great Tower and the surrounding curtain walls were built by Henry II from 1180. And they are built in a particular style where the tower is square and the surrounding towers on the curtain wall are also square. But Dover is besieged a generation later in the reign of King John. And these walls on the outside of the castle are built in John's reign. And you can see that there's been a shift from the square towers built by his father to round towers, which was more the fashion after the year 1200. They were preferring round towers because they thought they were stronger, because they thought they were better at deflecting missiles or they were more difficult to undermine. This was the original entrance built by John. And it proved too vulnerable. This was attacked in 1216 and the French came very close to getting in. They collapsed one of these towers and they were sort of fought off in the breach. So when they came to rebuild the castle in the 1220s, they just blocked off that entrance there. And they built this new gatehouse here, Constable's Gate, which you can see is all round towers. And it's built on this side of the castle where the ground falls away very steeply. So you can see how vital Dover was as a fortress, and you can also see how much thought went into the military technology of these castles.
Half a century later, Gilbert de Clare took defensive strategy to a whole new level. Caerphilly was the first castle in Britain designed to be defended by walls within walls. To strengthen his grip on territory taken from the native Welsh, de Clare laid out a new form of elaborate castle, in which there were multiple layers of defence. Every time an attacker overcame an obstacle, he would be faced by a new one. Penetrating one gatehouse led only to another. Crossing a drawbridge meant facing a portcullis and a further set of doors. And at every turn, the attacker would be exposed to crossfire from the adjacent towers and curtain walls. Finally, around all of this, there were water defences preventing undermining and keeping siege engines at a distance. Thanks to the efforts of the castle builders, defensive technology was advancing rapidly. But the opposing strength of the onslaught was escalating too. In the Welsh borderlands and many other theatres of conflict, history tells us that, despite their durability, castles could be conquered, changing hands from one side to another, time after time. A single castle might be Welsh-ruled, then English, then Welsh again, turn and turn about, a dozen times across the course of a century. And these transfers of control were rarely peaceful. Faced with such devastating onslaughts, the search began all over Europe for the perfect castle, the one that could not be taken, the one that could stand against any storm. The perfect castle might have been an impossible dream. But if any citadel anywhere in Europe came close to being impregnable, it was surely this one. Carcassonne. Carcassonne lies in the southwest of France, within striking distance of the Pyrenees. It's a strategic location, standing guard over the borderlands between France and the ancient kingdom of Aragon in northern Spain. The fortified city is concentric in design, with 2 outer walls complete with turrets, crenellations, and 53 towers and barbicans. A main gate, the Porte Narbonnaise, forms the only entry into the city. It's guarded by 2 flanking towers and a double barbican. The settlement inside has been fortified since Roman times, but it's the restoration of its medieval splendor that attracts 5 million visitors every year.
Alors cette cité, quand vous la regardez derrière moi, vous voyez que c'est quand même un élément unique. en Europe de par sa conservation. Et je pense que c'est ça que les gens viennent chercher ici, parce qu'on a un ensemble complet. Alors certes, elle a été restaurée par Viollet-le-Duc au XIXe siècle, mais seulement sur un tiers de l'ensemble. Et on peut retrouver ici les éléments constitutifs de cette défense du château fort. Reprenez vos yeux d'enfant et venez ici avec vos enfants, c'est ce que font les gens d'ailleurs. Ils viennent admirer un système de défense.
Its defensive system is what makes Carcassonne special. It has its origins in the 13th century, when a crusading army freed Carcassonne from the Cathar heresy which had shaken Christian Europe. The new ruler of Carcassonne was Simon de Montfort. An ultra-Orthodox Catholic, he brutally suppressed the Cathars. Thousands died as he harried them all over Languedoc. De Montfort was killed whilst besieging the heretics at Toulouse, and he was buried here in Carcassonne, in the Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire within the city walls. After de Montfort's death, a series of French kings strengthened the defences further, turning Carcassonne into one of the greatest fortresses in Christendom. At the centre of it all is the Count's Castle, the seat of feudal power. The massive east gate is protected by a barbican and a series of formidable towers. Beyond the castle, the whole of the fortified town is enclosed by the inner and outer walls built to exploit Carcassonne's natural topography. This is a defensive system on a grand scale. It's also a system that works because of 1,000 fine details. There are the irregular embossed walls with uneven surfaces, which make it practically impossible to use siege ladders against them. There are the ourdes, wooden shelters to protect the defending bowmen. And the bretèches, or brattices, balconies with machicolations, murder holes, offering deadly line of sight to the attackers below. There's genius too in the way the ancient Roman fortifications are integrated into the medieval circuit of double walls, towers and barbicans.
Alors, la première muraille en fait a été construite à la fin du IIIe siècle, début IVe par les Romains. À ce moment-là, donc, cette muraille n'est censée seulement protéger la cité, faire peur. Mais on est vraiment dans une défense passive, c'est-à-dire qu'on se protège, c'est tout. Et puis au XIIIe siècle, quand on va construire la deuxième muraille, on va rentrer véritablement dans une défense active, c'est-à-dire qu'on va vouloir contrer l'ennemi en amont, c'est-à-dire le déranger un maximum pour qu'il ne puisse pas prendre cette cité. Et donc, construction d'une seconde muraille, mais aussi certains éléments vont venir l'ennuyer, tels des assommoirs, des machicoulis, des ourdes, etc.
This active defensive system allowed the garrison to carry the fight to anyone who threatened Carcassonne. Carcassonne was bombarded by trebuchets, but the citadel was said to be untakeable. It was certainly a match for one of England's most gifted military leaders, the Black Prince. The Black Prince earned his spurs during the century-long struggle for control of France, which pitted the Plantagenet kings of England against the House of Valois. In 1355, his campaigning raids brought him as far as Carcassonne's outer walls. So far, but no further.
Alors le prince noir, effectivement, va venir jusqu'à Carcassonne durant la guerre de 100 ans, mais il ne s'approchera pas de la cité. On est à cette période où il y a deux remparts qui protègent cette ville, et donc elle fait peur à ce prince noir. Donc il va s'attaquer à la ville basse, y mettre le feu à cette bastide de Saint-Louis, mais la cité, il ne s'en approchera jamais.
The sympathetic restoration of Carcassonne by the 19th century architect Viollet-le-Duc allows us to appreciate this medieval masterpiece. Many regard it as Europe's finest example of active defense. A powerful citadel could underpin the authority of its lord, or establish the rule of a king over a new territory. But when a castle built by an invading king fell into the hands of a conquered people, it became a weapon turned against its own makers, a highly potent symbol of revolt. That's what happened here in Wales in 1404. Harlech Castle had been built for the English King Edward I, part of his so-called Ring of Iron, designed to crush Welsh resistance. Edward had chosen the site well. Landlocked today, back then it stood directly on the ocean. Supplies and troops could be brought here by ship as well as overland. And in building it, Edward's master mason, James of St. George, had deployed the most formidable military engineering of its day. But a century later, none of that was enough to keep Harlech from falling into Welsh hands. In 1400, Wales had risen up under its rebel leader, Owain Glyndŵr. The Welsh saw Glyndŵr as the promised son who would deliver them from English rule.
Over the next 2 or 3 years, he slowly recaptured most of Wales and was able to call himself the Prince of Wales. And he chose Harlech as this most important seat. It was the ancient site of the Welsh king Bran, a mythological king. So it became the most significant site associated with Glyndŵr. And here he held court.
Glyndŵr summoned to Harlech a powerful cabinet. Together they drew up a vision of an independent Wales, with its own church and parliament, its own laws and universities. Envoys from Europe paid tribute. For the rest of the decade, this was the court of a king, King Owain. But not everything in this game of siege and storm went the way of the Welsh. Glyndŵr had to reclaim a whole country, and it was a land full of English castles. Carreg Cennen held out for months against Glyndŵr and a force of 800 men. Caernarfon stood against him, and other castles began to fall back into English hands. The tide was turning against the Welsh. And then there was Prince Hal, Harry of Monmouth. The future King Henry V led the English fight back. In the end, Glyndŵr and his chief allies were surrounded in Harlech. Once more, this English castle was under threat, but this time it was the English themselves at the gates, and they came armed with an unfamiliar weapon.
Harlech Castle is besieged in 1408, and it was besieged by cannon. So here we've got a new form of attack. There's a cannon called the King's Daughter that levelled many of the stone walls of Harlech Castle and ultimately allowed the English attackers to take the castle. So here we see cannon used for one of the first times in an important English or Welsh siege, replacing the trebuchet as the principal form of attack.
The revolt had passed its high water mark, but Glyndŵr himself managed to slip away, though history records little more of him. English rule had been restored, but Harlech was soon to see yet more action, and now it would be the English fighting the English. By the 1460s, two rival factions were engaged in a long struggle for the English crown. York against Lancaster, the Wars of the Roses. The Lancastrians had established Harlech as one of their main strongholds in the fight against the Yorkist King Edward IV. Once again, thanks to its stout defences and the supply route by sea, Harlech proved difficult to take. As other fortresses fell, the castle became the last major Lancastrian stronghold. The Tudor family made it their centre of operations. French reinforcements sailed in to lend them support. In the end, the king had to mobilise an army 10,000 strong to seize the castle. But it was the Tudors who had the last laugh. Less than 20 years later, their favourite son, Henry Tudor, born in a Welsh castle, would be sailing back from France to end the Wars of the Roses by wresting the English crown from the House of York on the field of Bosworth. The Tudors brought stability to England. For the best part of 2 centuries, the British castle was left in peace, more a decorative symbol than a military tool. But in the 1640s, that all changed again. The English Civil War was a bloody struggle between Crown and Parliament. On the one side, King Charles I, on the other, Oliver Cromwell. And even at this relatively late date, the castle was to play its part in determining the outcome. With the development of artillery power, it might have seemed that the castle had had its day.
Stone walls will splinter and crack and eventually fall because they can't absorb the energy of a fast-moving cannonball. Elsewhere in Europe, they reverted back to earth defences, which will absorb the impact of a cannonball. But in England and Wales, we held on to our castles, and the last time they played any serious part in warfare was in the English Civil War.
Raglan Castle had been built in the 1460s by Sir William Herbert. An astute politician and an enthusiast for the profitable French wine trade, his wealth had remodelled his family's castle on a much grander scale. The result has been called one of the last formidable displays of medieval defensive architecture.
It's the most important castle built in the middle of the 15th century. Not only that, it's the most important castle ever built by Welshmen. Started by Sir William ap Thomas, one of the heroes of the Battle of Agincourt, and completed by his son, Sir William Herbert, later Earl of Pembroke.
William Herbert's hospitality was legendary. It inspired hymns of praise from scores of Welsh bards.
Raglan Castle was the most hospitable place anywhere in Wales. Many of the poems celebrate the wines that were in the cellars of Raglan Castle. One lists up to 24 different types of wine, and others talk about the River Rhone and the River Rhine flowing through the cellars of the castle at Raglan.
But 2 centuries later, what kind of a welcome would Raglan give the Roundheads of the 1640s? By the time the Parliamentary army pressed its siege on Raglan, the first phase of the English Civil War was effectively over. The castle was held for the king by Henry Somerset, Marquis of Worcester. But Raglan was one of the very last outposts of royal resistance, and its defiance was little more than a symbolic gesture.
It's one of the last places that held for the king. And I think it's the last gasp of what we've been seeing in the Middle Ages, this pattern of allegiance and homage. Henry, Marquis of Worcester, I think holds out because he cannot imagine not maintaining his allegiance to King Charles. Events were completely against him, and the social system in which he operated had changed. What he was demonstrating, I think, was almost a memory of the system that led to castles being built in the past.
But memory was scarcely enough. The Parliamentary Army brought up its artillery, a gun known as Roaring Meg. Raglan's resistance crumbled. As the royalist defenders cowered in the cellars, Roaring Meg put the great tower beyond any use as a defensive stronghold. But the fall of Raglan wasn't quite the end of the Civil War, or of the castle as a fortress. King Charles is taken prisoner, but the peace doesn't last for long. In the summer of 1648, royalist supporters take up arms again. Cromwell's reaction is furious. His new model army cuts a swathe across the country. They triumph at the Battle of St. Fagans, leaving hundreds of royalists dead and taking thousands prisoner. Now Cromwell makes a beeline for Pembroke. A former supporter, John Poyer, has switched sides and is holding the castle for the king.
In front of the walls we have Cromwell at the head of perhaps 6,000 men. But this is such a well fortified and defended place that Poyer is in a very strong position. He holds out here for 6-7 weeks. There are sallies of troops coming out and engaging the forces of the new model army, and pulses coming back against. There's some serious bloodshed here, but primarily this is a case of a siege. The thing is, Cromwell doesn't have the firepower that he needs to break through these huge medieval defences. So there's no decisive action. Eventually, however, Cromwell does get the big guns, literally, that he requires. And he tells Poyer in no uncertain terms that if he doesn't stop this madness, there is no relief coming. He is going to unleash hell in this town. He's going to unleash a Holocaust. Poyer recognises now that the king's cause is lost throughout England. There are no reinforcements coming to help him. He recognises that he has to look his fate in the eye, and he surrenders.
This time, it was endgame for King Charles. And the end of an era for the castle. The finessing of castle defences was a process that had taken hundreds of years. From the stone keeps of the Normans to the concentric walls of the later Middle Ages, and the active defence and architectural sophistication of citadels like Carcassonne. Castle builders were always battling to keep the castle strong. As they faced siege and storm, they devised structures which confronted the enemy with layer after layer of defence and exposed them to deadly peril at every turn. And even if, in the end, the castle had to bow to the inevitable in a new age of shock and awe, the work of the castle builders had proved itself amazingly resilient, always formidable, and sometimes close to impregnable. Castles. Citadels of world heritage. All over Europe, millions flock to see these masterpieces in stone. They are drawn by the astonishing scale of construction and by a sense of a lost world of heroism and chivalry. But castles are more than magnificent monuments to a past that's dead and gone. They hold the key to understanding a crucial period in the growth of our civilization. In this series, we're on a journey to discover how castles were built and why they were constructed the way they were, how that changed over centuries, and why they still have a grip on our imagination today. We'll meet the castle builders, the labourers and masons who did the hard work, the geniuses of design who imagined these medieval megastructures, the structural engineers who turned them into reality, and the kings and barons who commissioned them and lived in them. We'll show how the big history of the Middle Ages, the wars of France and England, shaped the castle. And how, in 1,000 bloody sieges and battles, the castle changed the course of that history. If you want to understand how the modern world was constructed, you need to understand the castle builders. The NATO Summit, Wales, 2014. The largest gathering of international leaders ever to take place in Britain. The commanders-in-chief of 60 of the world's most powerful armed forces have come together to debate and strategize. What they decide here may shape the future for all of us. And, in a masterstroke of modern media management, they've come to pose for their official pre-dinner portrait in front of a castle, Cardiff Castle. Castles have always been symbols of military might and authority, but they're also strongly associated with noble ideals and gracious living. Even in this era of high-tech warfare, it's an image worth 1,000 headlines. In this series, we've seen how building a medieval castle was a major feat of logistics and hard work, ingenuity and craftsmanship. And how the work of the castle builders stood up to the military onslaughts that were unleashed against it. In this final episode, we'll see why the castle matters, and how its appeal has always rested on its dual purpose, as a fortress and a residence.
A castle's primarily to defend a lord or a noble or a king, his family and his household, and also to command the territory of which he's the owner.
It's a very difficult balancing act, creating a building that is at the same time homely and warlike. And I think that is what makes castles fascinating. Reconciling those apparently contradictory imperatives is what makes them such a delight for children and grown-up medieval historians.
But as time went by, the balance between those functions shifted. The military effectiveness of castles began to decline as they became more and more vulnerable to the power of artillery. This is the story of that major change in the primary purpose of a castle. From fort to palace. It's a tale that will take us to France and to Germany, and into a new industrial age where the castle surprisingly gets a new lease of life. Across the centuries, castle builders became decorators and dreamers, cementing the place of their creations in the imaginations of everyone. The castle becomes a place of luxury, fantasy, and ceremony. Windsor Castle on the outskirts of London. In terms of the ceremony that's conducted here, this may be the most celebrated castle of them all. Windsor remains one of the principal homes of the British royal family. It's a tourist destination of global significance. Its status as a symbol glorifying the English monarchy dates back hundreds of years, to the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. Windsor was already a substantial castle when Edward came to the throne, but he spent a king's ransom enhancing its grandeur and majesty. It was said to be the most expensive secular building project of the entire Middle Ages in England. But it wasn't simply a vanity project. Edward had decided to press his claim to the throne of France. It was a bold and risky move. Success depended on the military support of the English nobles. Edward decided to make Windsor a focus for the cult of chivalry which underpinned his call to arms. Edward's stroke of genius was to reach back into the founding myths and legends of Britain, to the stories of King Arthur and his knights. Here at Windsor, he would construct a Camelot for his own age.
This is a really interesting moment politically and historically because the 100 Years' War has just started. It's in its early years. And he wants to make a bold statement, not just to France, who he's at war with, but to the rest of Europe. For Edward, aligning himself with King Arthur of great legend was going to make a bold statement. So Edward makes a promise, makes an oath that he's going to establish a vast round table of 300 knights, according to the chroniclers, another round table in Edward's own time. One of the special things about Arthur and his knights in legend is that they are peacekeepers. They protect the weak and they fight legitimate causes. So all of this ideological background that comes from the Arthurian myth feeds into Edward III's political agenda.
As the war against France begins in earnest, Edward honours his son, the Black Prince, for his valour in the field. And he organises spectacular tournaments and builds a new home for a select band of knights back in Windsor. The Order of the Garter, with its famous motto, "Shame on him who thinks evil of this," is the oldest and most prestigious order of chivalry in Britain. In using the castle to buttress his royal authority, Edward III could take inspiration from his own genealogy. He was the son of Edward II, whose birth at Caernarvon Castle had been a piece of flamboyant political theatre, orchestrated by his father, Edward I, Edward Longshanks. Longshanks may have used brutal force to subdue the Welsh and the Scots, but he was not afraid to use more romantic notions to reinforce his claims on Britain, as a remarkable object that's now housed in another royal castle shows us. This is the Great Hall of Winchester Castle. The enormous painted table that now hangs on the wall was said to be the very round table used by King Arthur and his knights. The names of the 24 knights appear in their allocated places around the edge of the table. In fact, Scientific tests date the construction of the table to the reign of Edward Longshanks. It was probably built to celebrate the betrothal of one of the king's daughters. And English monarchs continued to value this powerful symbol. In the 16th century, Henry VIII had the table repainted with a Tudor rose at its centre. The connection with Arthur legitimised a claim to the throne, and a central feature of the Arthurian myths was the castle. Unlike Winchester or Windsor, Tregerig Castle in South Wales is off the beaten track. Few visitors come here. Indeed, few people know that it even exists. And yet this secretive location has plenty to reveal about how the castle was actually used to delight and to entertain nobility in the Middle Ages. And it has something to say too about the castle's place in one of the most famous tales of King Arthur's knights. But the first thing that strikes you about the ruined castle is the sheer scale of the place.
Tregerig is the biggest inner wall, the biggest single enclosure of a castle anywhere in England and Wales. Bigger than Caerphilly, bigger than Windsor. What you see today is an enormous gatehouse and a very imposing tower connected by a curtain wall. So superficially, it looks a very impressive, defendable structure. Go inside these buildings and there's something very different. They're divided up into rooms, each of which is provided with ensuite facilities, a toilet or a latrine, a wash basin. There are fireplaces, there are glazed windows, and they're clearly not anything to do with defence. They're all to do with accommodating important people who came to this castle to retreat away from the cares of being a lord or lady.
The luxurious toilet facilities were finished with a quality of craftsmanship worthy of a palace. Even the masonry below the toilets shows an attention to detail which seems almost excessive to their purpose. But it would have been all too convenient for any would-be attacker to break into the castle via the shafts of these latrines. They indicate that the effort and resources lavished on building this huge castle weren't deployed to any military purpose. And this wasn't even the main castle used by the Lords of Usk. Tregerig was simply a base for them to entertain their guests and to go hunting. For the super-rich of the Middle Ages, the thrill of the chase was a serious business. Something that's very well evidenced in the art and the romantic literature of the times.
Castles and hunting are the subject of many medieval romances. These are the things that influenced the great men of the day. They're the things that they aspired to be, one of the heroes of the great medieval romance. One of the best known is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And Sir Gawain sets out on a journey to find the Green Knight to honour his bargain. He enters a hunting park. He crosses an open area of ground known as a laund, in which deer would graze or be driven for the hunt. And he sees on a hill above him the most wonderful castle rising up through the trees. And when you read that passage and you approach Tregerig across its open area of ground, it's almost as if you're Sir Gawain and living the poem for real.
In the mythical castle, Gawain finds himself isolated. But it's his integrity, not his skill with the sword, that's put to the test.
While all the other men are out hunting, doing noble chivalric deeds, the kinds of things that knights do when it's not wartime, Gawain is in the feminized space of the castle with the ladies. The ladies are actually used as a test to test his honour, his moral integrity. So the lord of the castle's wife comes to Gawain each day on 3 occasions and tries to seduce him. The castle in this romance is a place for testing the integrity, the morals, the honour of the knight.
In the story of Gawain, and in the real world of the Middle Ages, the castle is an arena where the battle of the sexes can be played out. And in this era of courtly love and chivalry, the gentler sex might often prove to be the stronger.
There are special spaces in the castle reserved for women. The lady of the castle, for example, if she's in residence, would have her own rooms, which would be separate from those of the men. You also have this idea in medieval culture at large that one's own body can be like a castle. So we get an inverted notion in medieval festivities and in literary depictions of actually women defending castles. There is a wonderful idea of the castle of love, which features in many round table festivities, for example. You would have a pretend castle built up of paper and other materials that could easily be breached, but the women would defend it by throwing rose petals at the men, and it was meant to be a symbolic gesture of men having to woo ladies to overcome their defences, to be able to win them legitimately and honourably. And so this wonderful idea of the castle of love becomes important in this sense for women as well.
The castle and the idea of romance. A perfect match that came together most famously in one special region of France. Fairy tale chateau. Gorgeous ceremonies, royal hunting expeditions, Renaissance palaces. Historians credit the Loire with giving birth to a whole way of life, the French way. It all happened because of a military disaster, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Defeated and chased from Paris by the English, the French court took refuge on the banks of the Loire. There was rich and fertile ground here, and river links right across the country. A golden age was about to begin. Once France had found peace again, economic prosperity led to an unprecedented architectural flowering. For the castle builders of the Loire, their time had come. Today, the town of Langeais still typifies the French way of life. It was already a well-established settlement when King Louis XI decided to build a chateau here in 1465.
Louis XI cherche en fait à montrer son pouvoir et son autorité. Il en est aux premières années de son règne. Donc c'est vrai qu'il cherche à montrer la présence royale sur le territoire tourangeau. Alors Tours, c'est alors la capitale du royaume. Et il choisit finalement la place de Langeais parce qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup de châteaux royaux sur ce côté-là de la Loire.
The facade the castle presents to the town suggests that its builders had some real military purpose in mind. It has all the conventional features of a defensive citadel. A forbidding fortress-like wall, an array of towers, a drawbridge.
Il a été construit en effet à la fin du Moyen-Âge, donc c'est un modèle assez caractéristique avec du côté de la ville une véritable forteresse très imposante et on a tous les éléments nécessaires en quelque sorte, donc les grandes tours, tout en haut le chemin de ronde sur machicoulis, donc qui permettait aux gardes de surveiller les environs. Et puis on a également le pont-levis. Donc tous ces éléments en fait à l'origine militaire ne vont pas servir au château de Langeais parce qu'il n'y avait pas de danger en Touraine. En fait, on s'en sert pour montrer la puissance royale.
It's Langeais' rear facade, which reveals the château's true raison d'être. This is no military bunker. It's a vast and opulent residence built to glorify the king's majesty.
L'ensemble est très bien conçu, très bien distribué, donc ça a été vraiment conçu dès la base comme une résidence, et puis une résidence agréable puisqu'on a beaucoup de fenêtres. Donc là, on voit que ce n'est pas un château fort pour se protéger, on essaye d'avoir de la lumière dans les pièces et avoir des pièces agréables à vivre en fait.
In 1491, just a quarter of a century after it was built, Langeais witnessed one of the most significant weddings in French history. The bride was just 14 years old, but she was already married. She was Anne, Duchess of an independent Brittany. To try to protect that independence against the kings of France, Anne had entered into a marriage by proxy with Maximilian of Austria. But this alliance with the faraway Habsburgs had failed to deliver. France invaded Brittany. Anne was left with little choice. She had to ask the Pope to annul her first marriage, and she had to marry Charles VIII of France instead.
Bien sûr, on avait demandé l'annulation du mariage de Anne et de Maximilien au pape, mais la décision se faisant attendre, eh bien, on a anticipé et on a célébré le mariage à Langeais avant d'avoir obtenu l'annulation du précédent mariage. Donc on essayait de ne pas trop ébruiter en effet cet événement, d'où la grande discrétion voilà, avec les horaires et puis le château de Langeais aussi, puisque la cour n'y résidait pas à ce moment-là.
The quick and secretive early morning ceremony took place here in Langeais, with none of the customary royal pomp, but in front of a small group of influential witnesses.
Le témoin d'Anne de Bretagne, c'était le prince d'Orange, et puis le témoin de Charles VIII, c'était son plus proche cousin, Louis d'Orléans, alors qui deviendra d'ailleurs roi quelques années plus tard sous le titre de Louis XII. Et puis, bien sûr, le chancelier de France, un des grands personnages du royaume, était présent également à ce mariage. Et donc, on a signé le contrat de mariage qui était un véritable programme politique, en fait.
Evidently, these powerful friends and allies of Charles were willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that the papal annulment had not yet been agreed. Charles and Anne were joined in matrimony, and Brittany was united with the Kingdom of France. But Anne continued to stand up for her people, and her fascinating life story has another twist to it. Much sooner than she could have anticipated, she was to become Queen of France for a second time. The celebrations marking Anne's second marriage to a French king also took place in the Loire. This time, the venue was the royal chateau of Blois. In 1498, King Charles had died after an accident. The new king was his cousin, Louis XII. As Prince of Orléans, he'd been a witness at Charles and Anne's wedding just 7 years before. Louis had been born at Blois, and on his accession to the throne, he embarked on the reconstruction of the chateau where he'd grown up.
Louis XII et Anne de Bretagne affectionnent particulièrement ce château. Louis XII y est né, il y a grandi. C'était à l'époque le pôle d'une véritable culture de cour réunie par son père Charles d'Orléans, notamment une cour poétique, s'étant en quelque sorte retiré de la politique pour se consacrer plutôt à du mécénat culturel. C'est donc dans ce milieu que Louis XII a grandi, qu'il a été baigné.
Blois was already regarded as one of the most beautiful fortresses in France, but Louis resolved to turn it into a true palace. And having cemented France's annexation of Brittany by marrying Anne in Nantes, Louis brought his bride back here for the wedding celebrations. This time, there was to be no secrecy. Blois became the setting for a succession of regal gatherings and diplomatic summits. Archduke Philip of Austria paid his respects, Machiavelli too, and Cesare Borgia came here to be married. At Blois, Anne and Louis presided over a court of dazzling ceremonial and cultural distinction. The chateau's central courtyard is a panorama of French architectural history. There's the great Gothic hall, which dates from the Middle Ages. From the 16th century on, it received the official representatives from every part of France, the Estates General.
Alors, la salle des États généraux fait partie en effet des salles les plus exceptionnelles du château. Elle a d'ailleurs pu être datée très précisément par dendrochronologie, donc l'étude de l'âge du bois dans la charpente, qui date cette charpente précisément de 1214. Donc c'était une salle qui a aujourd'hui exactement 800 ans. Cette grande salle servait en quelque sorte de salle polyvalente qui recevait les grandes cérémonies organisées par les comtes de Blois et plus tard par les rois de France.
The Hall of Estates also served as a ballroom and as a venue for concerts. Nowadays, the huge space conveys the whole story of Blois in a very modern, interactive form. Across the courtyard is the wing added by Louis XII around the time of his wedding to Anne. The royal propaganda presented her as the perfect queen, a symbol of union and peace between France and Brittany. And yet, to the end, she intrigued tirelessly to defend the independence of her duchy. Anne was in residence at Blois for 15 years. When she died here in 1514, her funeral lasted 40 days. The following year, King Louis was succeeded by Francois I. Francois was responsible for Blois' most decorative feature, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture. The chambers of Francois' new wing are accessed from an astonishing polygonal staircase which projects outward from the line of the facade. The ornamentation is Italianate. The balconies are designed both to see and to be seen. Courtiers could watch the king regally ascending the staircase, and on other occasions they could climb up themselves for a grandstand view of festivities in the courtyard below. Even today, the elegance and grandeur of Blois is palpable. It's easy to conjure up the spirits of those who paraded around this courtyard in its glory days.
Pour moi, travailler au château de Blois est un véritable privilège. D'abord parce que c'est un lieu qui réunit l'histoire, l'architecture, qui abrite aujourd'hui des collections extraordinaires. Et puis surtout, c'est un lieu, un château qui a vécu, qui a été la demeure des comtes de Blois, des rois et des reines de France pendant plus d'un siècle. Et leur présence habite encore ces murs. Et puis, il y a dans ce château des moments magiques, notamment le soir, quand la cour se vide de ses visiteurs. On sent monter dans les murs la présence de tous ces habitants qui ont laissé une partie de leur âme.
In the changing facades of this chateau, we can see the ebb and flow of French history. The rise and fall of dynastic hopes and territorial ambitions. But if the story of Blois is one of adaptation and renewal, another of Europe's most famous castles is home to a quite remarkable continuity across the centuries. Eltz Castle, Berg Eltz, has been in the hands of one family since its construction in the 12th century. Unlike so many German castles, it was unscathed by the wars of the Middle Ages. The present Count, Dr. Karl Graf zu Eltz, represents the 33rd generation of the family to have charge of the castle. The castle stands guard over the Elzbach River, a tributary of the Moselle and a historically important trading route to the fertile Mayfeld, the breadbasket of the region. The entire foundations of the castle stand on top of a narrow column of natural rock which rises 70 meters from the riverbed below. With so little lateral floor space to work with, the castle builders here looked upwards. Berg Eltz is 8 stories tall. Its towers soar up to 40 meters above the rock, and its timber frame structures and fairy tale turrets make it the perfect picture book castle. The accommodation is comprised of 3 interlinking houses. It's a Gannebenberg, a castle belonging to a community of joint heirs. From the early Middle Ages, 3 branches of the same family shared ownership here. They gave their names to the 3 separate living spaces, the Rubenach, Rodendorf and Kempenich houses. Recent scientific tests on the timber have revealed that many of the rooms here date back to the castle's earliest history.
Die neuesten Untersuchungen haben uns nur positive Ergebnisse gebracht. Burg Eltz ist fast überall wesentlich älter, als wir es glaubten. Das kleine Rodendorfer Haus ist nicht aus dem Jahre 1560, wie wir anhand eines Fenstersatzes glaubten, sondern aus dem Jahr 1290. Dieses Haus ist nicht 1400, in dem wir drin sitzen, das kleine Kempenicher, sondern es ist 1290. Und das große, schöne Rübenacher Haus ist nicht 1470, wie die Wandmalereien sagen, sondern 1311. Burg Eltz ist älter geworden, die Geschichte muss neu geschrieben werden.
Berg Eltz has been called the Knight's Castle par excellence, and it boasts a splendid Knight's Hall. This was where the 3 family branches gathered for festivities, to talk about family business and to resolve family disputes. Above the doorway, the rose of silence reminds everyone that what's said here should go no further. And the jester's head symbolizes freedom of speech within the hall. Medieval jesters were allowed to say whatever they wanted without fear of consequences. Frank talk within the family contributed to centuries of stability for Berg Eltz. The durability of the castle builders' work here is remarkable. All the same, maintaining the fabric of buildings which are centuries old involves huge cost and effort. The Eltz family is now supported in the upkeep of their historic treasure by the state. But for the 33rd generation of the dynasty, the responsibilities remain onerous.
Natürlich ist es eine Last, ein solches Haus zu führen. Es ist eine große Verantwortung gegenüber der Familie, gegenüber der Öffentlichkeit und gegenüber einem selber. Und es war für mich von frühester Jugend an klar, dass ich diese Aufgabe werde schultern müssen. Auf der anderen Seite ist es ein Haus, das durch seine schiere Schönheit einen für jede Arbeit entschädigt. Und deswegen bin ich eher ein glücklicher Mensch als ein mit schwerer Last beladener.
Berg Eltz is rightly celebrated for the vistas of the castle that can be enjoyed from all around the grounds below. From 1965 to 1992, an engraving of one of the views featured on the 500 Deutschmark note, something that evokes nostalgia in many of the German visitors to the castle. And for everyone who comes here, Berg Eltz is a rare glimpse of a bygone age, the remarkable survival of buildings and of values which have disappeared elsewhere in our modern world.
Eine Burg wie Burg Eltz zeigt jedermann seine Geschichte. Keineswegs nur die Geschichte der Herren und Grafen zu Eltz, sondern die Geschichte aller Deutschen. Und diese fasziniert dann doch mehr, als man so allgemein glaubt.
The Eltz family story is a true exception. It's a direct and personal link to the traditions and values which built the medieval castle, and which they have carried down the centuries to this very day. But of course, the mainstream of history was flowing in a very different direction. 250 years ago, a revolution began. The Industrial Revolution. Invention and innovation, scientific discoveries, water power and steam power, new machines and devices. A new mechanical age, consuming raw materials and minerals, and spewing out more and more product. There was change in every aspect of life, and the castles seemed destined to be left behind. But this was the age of surprises. Many castles did fall into ruin, but others found a new role in this industrial era. The wealth created by industry wasn't spread evenly. The workers suffered squalor. They lived in cramped housing without sanitation, in hovels that spread disease and death. The new industrialists became fabulously rich. Some yearned to live in castles like the barons of old. And the old aristocracy realized the value of the mineral rights on their vast estates. On the sites of what were once modest fortifications, men like the Baron Penrhyn, who controlled the North Wales slate industry, were able to build entirely new fantasy castles. Here they could display their wealth and entertain their guests in lavish style. Fine dining in North Wales, but the most spectacular reimagining of the castle in Victorian times happened at the other end of the country. The Romans built a stone fort in Cardiff, and the castle keep here dates from the Norman invasion. But the castle we see today is largely a byproduct of the black diamond, coal. In the late 19th century, Cardiff grew exponentially to become the world's largest coal port. The docks had been developed by the second Marquis of Bute, whose family had acquired large estates in South Wales by marriage and who'd begun to rebuild the ancient castle in Cardiff. The Bute's fortunes were further enhanced on the floor of Cardiff's coal exchange. Here, contracts to ship out vast quantities of Welsh steam coal were agreed. Legend has it that it's where the world's first £1 million cheque was written. The coal was hewed from beneath the South Wales valleys by a huge workforce who saw little financial reward for their efforts. Much of the land above was owned by aristocrats like the Butes, and it was they who benefited from the mineral rights. When John Patrick Crichton Stuart succeeded as the third Marquis of Bute, he decided to lavish some of his great good fortune on the restoration of Cardiff Castle. In a modernising age, he was a man who loved antiquity. Bute dressed his industrial wealth in clothes of medieval splendour. His dreams were dreams of the castles of old, of romance, of knights and their ladies. He and his architect William Burgess made an exquisite new version of the past. It shines in all its medieval glory in the heart of the world's capital of coal. Ultimately, it was built on the sweat and blood of the miners. But one castle wasn't enough for the Marquis. On the outskirts of Cardiff, his vivid Victorian imagination and untold wealth produced another Gothic fantasy, a fairy tale castle in the woods. Castell Coch was also designed by Burgess. Given free rein by his paymaster, Burgess didn't hold back. Dazzling ceilings, extravagant decoration, fanciful fireplaces. It was all a bit much for the colliers who'd done all the hard work. As they were finishing their night shifts, the Marquis and his lady might have been waking up in the luxury of this astounding bedroom. Except that they very rarely did. For all the money spent, there's no evidence that the Buttes slept for more than a handful of nights here. This outlandish wash basin was a utility scarcely ever utilized. Today, both of Butte's castles are in public hands, and Cardiff's appeal as a tourist destination stands squarely on the enduring magic of the castle that Burgess restored. It's a palace of wonders, and now a gilded stage for global diplomacy. Where the Buttes once feasted, world leaders now sit down together. Our story has come full circle. Once again, the castle is the seat of military might and regal hospitality. In this series, we've seen the castle develop across the centuries. From the early days of the motte and bailey and the square stone keeps of the Normans, the castle builders were constantly looking to innovate. By combining numerous round towers in one unbroken defensive line, Richard the Lionheart found a way to strengthen the castle's design in Normandy's magnificent Chateau Gaillard. Caerphilly was the first castle in Britain designed to be defended by walls within walls. It took protective strategy to a whole new level, in which there were multiple layers of fortification. And in the active defensive system of Carcassonne, the castle came close to being impregnable. This was a defensive system on a grand scale, which allowed the garrison to carry the fight to anyone who threatened the citadel. It was said to be untakeable, the perfect castle. In the 21st century, these architectural details still fascinate children of all ages.
The castle's big, and it's like the safest place you can go and stay.
More than any other historical structure, the castle gets a grip on their imaginations in their classroom projects. And it enables them to visualize a whole medieval way of life when they make their school visits. But castles are fun as well as being educational. Within sight of the real Windsor Castle, the Legoland Resort trades on the excitement that the castle represents for the whole family. The model of Caerphilly Castle here was carefully constructed with more than 100,000 plastic bricks. It took 289 hours to make. It reminds us the real thing was built in little more than 3 short years. Here, the castle stands as a global icon, alongside models of world cities like Paris, Amsterdam, and London. Whether they're the thrilling centerpieces of leisure parks or pulling in the crowds as tourist attractions in their own right, castles have never been more popular. But they're not just objects of wonder for the young.
My career has been in ruins, and it still is today. And the most impressive ruins of all are those of castles. I've been fascinated by castles, partly because I see them as the theatres in which some of the great political, social, and even family events of the Middle Ages took place. Castles are the most tangible reminder of the magnificence that was achieved in the Middle Ages.
This is power. This is an expression of power, whether it's military power or symbolic power or what have you. I find castles fascinating because I'm allowed to go around them now in a democratic age. You know, this was a place built by the most powerful man in Western Europe, and now I can wander around his bedroom. I can sit in the place where he prayed to the Almighty. These buildings have become democratized. That is what makes castles fascinating. That is what makes them such a delight for children and grown-up medieval historians.
Whatever age we are, the castle appeals to us because of its strength as well as its beauty.
Castles have a brutal side to them. They remind us of the reality of our past, how our lives and society has changed. It was a time when people and nations were oppressed by the castle builders and the castle owners, but also they conjure up in our minds images of knights riding out, doing wonderful chivalric deeds, of damsels in distress needing protecting. They hearken back to a golden age that never existed, but that we would like to imagine once did.
Whether they originated in a golden age or not, castles have stood the test of time. Today, their ramparts are open to us all to explore. And the more we learn about them, the more we're drawn to investigate further. The castle builders not only constructed an intriguing past, they built a solid future too.